Once, Russia's tanks symbolized power, dominance, and Putin's iron grip. Now, they're burning wrecks littering the battlefield. For decades, Russia claimed to have the strongest tank force in the world, with endless reserves ready to crush any enemy. But the war in Ukraine has revealed the truth. Those tanks aren't invincible, they're cannon fodder. And the losses are staggering. Oryx has confirmed 3,577 tanks destroyed, abandoned, or captured. Ukraine says the real number is over 9,000. These so-called mighty machines are now trophies for Ukraine and reminders of Russia's crumbling military. So what does Putin have left? Are Russia's legendary storage depots hiding reinforcements, or is this just the final act of a desperate war machine running on fumes? In this video, we'll uncover what's really left in Russia's tank reserves and why Putin's military might never recover. Now, counting losses is straightforward enough. You just follow the trail of burned-out husks, shattered turrets, and abandoned hulks scattered across the battlefield, often well documented across social media. But what about figuring out what's left? How do you count tanks that haven't seen the battlefield in decades, locked away in sprawling storage depots? It's a far murkier challenge. However, it's a challenge two internet sleuths have taken on with remarkable precision and lots of creativity. First, there's Covert Cabal, a YouTube channel renowned for its unorthodox, by-the-numbers coverage of the war in Ukraine. And second, @HighMast on X, formerly Twitter, a social media detective whose meticulous tracking of Soviet and Russian storage bases is unmatched. Together, they have gone to extraordinary lengths to uncover what's left in Russia's tank reserves. Their methods are a masterclass in modern military sleuthing, blending technology, tenacity, and a willingness to spend both time and resources. So how do they do it? Well, early efforts relied on publicly available Google Maps images, yielding an estimate of around 6,000 tanks in storage, half of which could potentially be restored. But those images came with major limitations, widely varying dates and incomplete views. To address this, Covert Cabal upgraded to high-resolution satellite imagery and purchased new images with controlled dates for consistency. In one case, they even paid to have a satellite remain over the site until cloud cover finally cleared so they could capture daily photos. Yet counting tanks was just the beginning. Covert Cabal took things further, using advanced modeling techniques to create detailed 3D reconstructions of specific Russian storage bases, complete with every last vehicle, building, and fence. This granular approach provided invaluable insights into the layout and operations of the bases, marking areas for storage, maintenance, and even scrapping. In other words, Russia's tank storage bases ceased to be a mystery. On the other hand, @HighMast brought a relentless focus to identifying tank types. Given that the various tank types differ in size by less than 2 feet in length or width, this was truly a Herculean task, often reduced to a single pixel in satellite images. Through painstaking analysis, they categorized tanks by condition and developed a tiered system: decent, poor, and worst. Decent tanks were those that might need heavy repairs but that could still be salvaged relatively quickly. Poor tanks, often packed tightly together and untouched for years, are those that would require extensive overhauls. Worst tanks? These are the scrap-worthy hulks, missing turrets, barrels, or more, that would only be resurrected in desperation. Notice anything missing? Yep, none of these categories include good tanks, not a single one. The days when Russia could simply pluck functional tanks off the lot are long gone. What's left are varying levels of rust, decay, and logistical nightmares. It's a grim reminder of just how far the Russian war machine has fallen and the lengths it must go to keep its armor rolling. But before we reveal the pitiful state of Russian tank storage, keep one thing in mind. These numbers aren't set in stone, as Covert Cabal explains. For instance, advances in satellite resolution, like moving from a 20-inch image to a 12-inch image, allowed the pair to refine earlier numbers and even reclassify previously blurry images into identifiable tanks. To ensure accuracy, every count was cross-checked, sometimes multiple times, and argued over until a consensus was reached. So what's the consensus? As of July 2024, the last time Covert Cabal updated the total number of remaining tanks, this is reportedly what Russia is working with across 9 storage bases: 700 decent tanks, 1,846 poor tanks, and 1,111 worst tanks. That's 3,657 tanks remaining in Russian storage. As for the specific types of tanks, here's the breakdown: 1,167 T-62s, 1,042 T-72A Urals, 499 T-64s, 418 T-72Bs, 260 T-80B BVs, 216 T-55s, 55 T-80U UDs, and 0 T-90s. Among these, the T-80Bs have suffered the greatest hit, dropping to a little over 20% of their pre-war numbers, which were 1,207. That's if you don't count the supposedly most advanced main battle tank to have achieved operational status within the Russian military, the T-90, which was rapidly thrust into the war effort. Before the invasion started, Russia had 112 of these tanks in reserve. By mid-2023, their number dropped to 89. By mid-24, not a single one remained in storage. They've all been sent to the front, consumed by the grinding demands of the war. How they performed there is an entirely different discussion, as Oryx reported that 117 T-90Ms, the most capable model in the family, were lost to the war effort. But this talk of Russia's most advanced tanks leads us to pose an important question. Where are the T-14 tanks? After all, the T-14 Armata, unveiled with much fanfare in 2015, was supposed to represent the pinnacle of Russian engineering, a symbol of its military supremacy. And yet, in a war where every tank counts, the T-14 is conspicuously absent. According to Covert Cabal, between 20 and 50 T-14s were built and are now in service with the Russian military. However, they aren't actively used in Ukraine in a combat role. Sergei Chemezov, the CEO of Rostec Corporation, Russia's state-owned defense conglomerate, offers a simple explanation for this. The T-14 is simply too expensive to be fielded in Ukraine. A single T-14 costs anywhere between $5 million and $9 million, a major increase compared to the T-80, T-72, and even T-90. But back to the tanks Russia has in storage. Most of these tanks are organized by type and stored in a single base to simplify maintenance, repair, and training for the staff. With this in mind, let's have a closer look at the Russian tank storage bases and the types of tanks that can be found on their premises. First, let's quickly go over the bases storing these tanks. In Russia, there are three primary types of bases: the central tank reserve bases, the storage and repair bases, and factories or tank repair bases. The bulk of our focus will be on the first category, which are the key locations where Russia's tanks are stored long-term. These central tank reserve bases date back to the end of World War II and are the primary sites for a wide variety of tanks, from Soviet-era relics to more modern models. Managed by the main Automotive Armored Directorate of the Russian Ministry of Defense, known as GAB-2, these bases maintain the army's tank fleet and ensure they remain ready for deployment. But as you'll soon see, the GAB-2's record in this area is far from stellar. Typically, these bases include everything necessary to support their operations, including administrative buildings, troop accommodations, hangars for maintenance, and organized storage areas. There are even disposal zones for scrapped vehicles and fuel depots to support logistical needs. Most bases also have rail transport loading areas to facilitate the movement of tanks when required. Let's look more closely at 7 central tank reserve bases spread across Russia's military districts. The 22nd base in Kostroma Oblast is the sole central tank reserve base in the Western Military District of importance for this video. In the Central Military District, we find the 349th base in Topchika, Altai Krai, the 1,311th base in Verkhnaya Pishma, Sverdlovsk Oblast, the 2,544th base in Kozulka, Krasnoyarsk Krai. Another 3 bases await in the Eastern Military District: the 111th base in Komsomolsk-on-Amur, Khabarovsk Krai, the 769th base in Ulan-Ude, Burachia, and the 1,295th base in Arseniev, Primorsky Krai. The last base we'll examine, the 103rd Armored Tank Repair Plant in Transbaikal Oblast, used to be a tank repair base. Unlike the central tank reserve bases, which focus on long-term storage, these repair bases are tasked with making larger, more intricate repairs to tanks and other armored vehicles. Over time, however, the lines between these facilities have become increasingly blurred. That's how some of these repair plants have taken on the additional role of storing tanks for longer-term periods, making them more akin to central bases in function. The 103rd base was also turned into a storage and repair base, the second category of Russian storage bases. Storage and repair bases are typically designed for short-term storage, housing extra vehicles and equipment for active units while also keeping them ready for immediate use. However, the 103rd base stands out, as it holds more tanks than most of the central tank reserve bases. This makes it a particularly interesting location for further investigation. Of course, there are other storage bases housing tanks in Russia beyond the ones we'll mention. Take the 6,018th base in Kamyshlov, Sverdlovsk Oblast as an example. Prior to 2021, this had about 200 tanks. Now it has less than 100. This makes it a far less significant player in the grand scheme of Russia's tank reserves. But for our purposes, we're only focusing on the bases that house a more substantial number of tanks. which allows us to gain insight into the scale of Russia's remaining armored forces. Let's start with the 22nd base for the reserve and repair of tanks. Located in the Kostroma Oblast, this base has a long history as one of Russia's key tank storage sites. Over the past few decades, it's housed a vast array of armored vehicles. However, recent events have left this once impressive number significantly depleted. In 2023, the base saw a noticeable decrease in the number of operational tanks, with the 125 tanks deemed to be in good condition by covert cabal disappearing over the span of just 7 months. Though there was a possibility that these tanks were stored in garages, the satellite images indicated a likelier option: deployment. The dominant models here were the T-80Us and T-98s, though the latter were mostly shipped out in the coming months. As for the T-80s, at least 165 of them have been stationed at the base for well over a decade, with no apparent movement since at least 2011. This long-term stagnation raises doubts about their true condition, as such prolonged disuse would naturally degrade their operational readiness. By 2024, the number of tanks in the base had dropped even further. Originally home to 749 tanks before the war, the 22nd base now holds only 180 tanks. This marks a staggering loss of more than 3/4 of the tanks that were once stationed here. Given the extensive losses and the condition of the remaining vehicles, it's safe to say that this base is rapidly approaching the point where it could be considered nearly empty. The T-80s still dominate the base, but with the tanks being in a state of deterioration, the 22nd base perfectly captures just how depleted Russia's reserves have become as it scrapes the bottom of its tank stocks. Next up is the 103rd Armored Tank Repair Plant. This facility, located in the urban-type settlement of Atamanovka, has been involved in the repair and modernization of various Soviet-era tanks. Initially, Russian sources claimed that the 103rd plant could repair an average of 22 to 23 T-62s per month. However, other sources later revealed a more modest output of about 8 per month. In 2023, the plant took on a large contract to modernize 800 T-62M tanks, sending several batches to the Special Military Operation Facility in Ukraine. But despite the ongoing work, the plant's overall capacity has remained constrained, and in terms of tank numbers, the situation has stayed remarkably stable. The facility housed 380 tanks in 2023, and this number has largely remained unchanged. The only change refers to some movements of older models like the T-64, but the overall stock has pretty much remained the same. The dominance of the T-62s, alongside ongoing modernization efforts, highlights the importance of this base in ensuring the continued use of older tanks in Russia's current military operation. After all, old is the only thing they have left. Let's now move to the 111th Central Tank Reserve Base in southeastern Russia. This base, one of the original Soviet armor storage facilities, has also seen a dramatic decrease in the number of tanks stored there. No surprises here. In its prime, the base housed over 1,000 tanks. However, by June 2024, this number had dwindled to less than 300, a reduction of over 70%. The majority of the remaining tanks are aging T-55s and T-62s, with many of the more valuable models like the T-80s having been pulled from the base for deployment. In fact, the base, which once held over 300 T-80s, now has very few of these tanks left. The 111th base, however, did have a peculiar development in 2024. A surge of 63 new tanks appeared in a specific section. Of course, when we say new, we mean new compared to the previous count, not new condition-wise. In fact, these tanks were as far away from new as possible. Using satellite imagery, covert cabal determined that most of these tanks were missing their turrets. This finding led to the conclusion that the new tanks likely came from nearby scrap piles. Interestingly, the scrapping zone of the 111th base is the only section brimming with tanks. Others are pretty much deserted, with the remaining tanks considered obsolete. What's more, the whole base is far from its glory days. Once a renowned, well-organized facility, this base is now packed with collapsing garages, broken fences, and other consequences of passing time and neglect. The security perimeter has also been weakened significantly, which explains why some individuals have been able to photograph the base and even use drones to survey it. How the mighty have fallen. The same can be said about the fate of the 769th Central Tank Reserve Base, the largest tank by storage size before the war. Originally known as the 227th Storage and Repair Base, it was a crown jewel of Russia's tank storage network, sitting on a sprawling 3.86 square miles and housing some of the most iconic models in Soviet and Russian military history. But since the onset of the war in Ukraine, the 769th base has become a graveyard for Russia's tank reserves, and the numbers are quite sobering. In 2023, this base has seen a sharp decline in its stock, from an impressive 857 tanks to just 630. The vast majority were aging T-72s, with a smattering of T-62s and other older models mixed in. By 2024, the situation has only worsened. The base continues to experience dramatic losses, now down to a fraction of its pre-war inventory. From May to September 2024 alone, the base saw the loss of 79 tanks, an alarming rate of nearly 20 tanks per month. As these numbers drop, the remainder of the once majestic stock of tanks, 300 of which have sat tightly packed together for years without maintenance, is becoming increasingly useless. The severe weather of the region, relentless rain, snow, and wind certainly doesn't help. Since the most recent tanks stored at the 769th base are housed outside, they have been left exposed to the harsh elements, accelerating their decline. This means that the tanks that remain in this base, rusted and neglected, may never see the front lines again. Next, we turn our attention to the 349th Central Tank Storage and Repair Base. Located in central Russia, this base has retained a notable portion of its pre-war tank stock, with 450 tanks still accounted for in 2023, down from 550 at the start of the conflict. In 2024, the situation has remained the same, as the base kept roughly 84% of its pre-war numbers. However, these numbers come with an important caveat. You see, most of the tanks remaining are T-72s, with a mix of T-62s and T-64s, many of which are in poor condition. While it's difficult to assess the exact state of these tanks due to snow in satellite imagery, one thing's for sure: this base's once vast and active inventory is now a shadow of its former self. Historically, the 349th base has been an important location, especially during the Cold War. This has to do with its strategic location near the Chinese border and along a branch of the Trans-Siberian Railway. In the years following the collapse of the Soviet Union, the base served as a central tank storage facility, with over 1,000 tanks housed there at its peak. At the time, it could easily have supplied enough vehicles to equip multiple tank divisions. Now, it can't even supply enough operational vehicles for a decent military parade. The 1,295th Central Tank Reserve and Storage Base is no better. After the Cold War, this base, located in the Russian Far East, became a key facility for storing aging tanks like the T-54, T-55, and T-62. These models had been phased out in favor of the more modern variants like the T-72 and T-80. Though the Cold War has long been completed, the composition of the tanks located at the 1,295th base remained pretty much the same. Though the base housed 136 T-80Bs before the war, by mid-2023 there were no signs of them, and this fact speaks volumes about the condition of the vehicles still seen in the base. Most of them are far from combat ready and have been largely overshadowed by more modern Russian tanks. In fact, the more recent satellite images confirm that over half of the tanks located here can be considered complete junk. They show no signs of movement or maintenance for months. The numbers are also underwhelming. In 2023, the 1,295th base went from 240 tanks to just 90. Now, one explanation for this sharp decline could be that some tanks have been moved into garages during winter months. However, given that the same tanks were left exposed outdoors during previous years, this explanation is fairly unlikely. There were similar numbers of tanks in 2024, all in varying degrees of disrepair. The next base we'll look into, the 1,311th Tank Reserve Base, stands out among others in the video. How so? Well, this is the only base that actually saw an increase in the number of tanks housed there, at least on the surface. Satellite imagery suggests that the base housed approximately 300 tanks in 2022, a figure that rose to around 400 by 2023. However, this apparent growth might be deceptive. It might have to do with tanks being moved out of long disused garages, many of which have been demolished over the years, rather than any actual reinforcements. As for the types of tanks, the base contains a mix of older models including T-54s, T-55s, T-62s, and different variants of T-72s and T-80BVs. Notably, these tanks are among the better preserved in Russia's storage network. But this doesn't mean they're fit for combat, it just means they're considered suitable for restoration. With the 2,544th Central Base of Reserve Armored Vehicles, the last one we'll examine, it's back to decline, decay, and disappointment. This facility experienced a reduction from 550 tanks in 2022 to 420 in 2023. That's a 130 tank drop in a single year. The tanks now stored at this base consist of a mix of older T-62s, upgraded T-64s, and predominantly T-72s, reflecting the overarching trend of using somewhat modernized models while still relying on older Soviet-era stock. While the 2,544th base retains a reasonable stock of tanks compared to some nearly emptied facilities, the decline in its numbers and the state of its tanks exemplifies the growing pressure on Russia's logistical and manufacturing capacities to sustain its war effort. Besides these primary storage sites, there are approximately 8 additional smaller locations that collectively hold fewer than 400 tanks. Covert Cabal puts this number at 326. When you total all the remaining tanks across all these bases, it's abundantly clear that it's only a matter of time before the Russian stock is completely exhausted. According to experts, this could happen in as little as 2 years. What a sad ending for a country whose predecessor, the Soviet Union, once boasted a mind-boggling 63,900 tanks. But what do you think? Will Russia ever truly run out of tanks? And if so, when? Or do you believe the ever-so-resilient Russian military will find a way to keep their aging fleet rolling, no matter the odds? Share your thoughts in the comments section below. Now go and check out Russia's biggest weapon storage is almost depleted, or click this other video instead.